My name is Sarah Brewington, and it is my privilege to interview my father, Edward Brewington, for the Clark Commemoration Project on behalf of the Hastings Historical Society and at the request of Eddie Crawford. I'll be interviewing my father about his experience at CCNY and studying under Dr. Kenneth Clark.
It's a real pleasure to be a part of a celebration and commemoration for Dr. Clark and his wife, Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark. Although I didn't know her personally, I had an opportunity to study under Dr. Clark at the City College in the 1960s.
Edward, before we get into the 60s, tell me a little bit about what you've been up to since graduating from CCNY.
It's been a long journey, and it's been great. I've had many years working in corporate America, IBM, Times Mirror, KinderCare in New York, California, and Oregon. And I've also taught college, both undergraduate and graduate levels in New York, California, and in Oregon. And currently, I have an appreciation for what you're doing in terms of your historical society, because I'm on the board of the Oregon Historical Society. And actually, I would say that spending time reconnecting with history has valuable lessons for all of us going forward.
I understand that you had Dr. Clark as a professor at CCNY, so what motivated you to sign up for his course?
Okay, well, let me start back a bit, and I'm going to go back to the 1950s when I was a young man in North Carolina attending segregated schools. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 used Dr. Clark, both his wife and his study on children reacting to dolls and the effect that segregation had on them, black versus white. I heard that Dr. Clark had been a part of that decision, and having gone to a segregated school until I got to New York in 1956, which, by the way, that was 2 years after the Supreme Court decision, the schools in the South were still segregated and would continue to be, in many cases, well into the 1960s. So when I saw this course, Social Psychology by Dr. Kenneth Clark, it resonated with me in that this is the Dr. Clark who was used in terms of the Supreme Court decision. And so that influenced me in signing up for that course.
Edward, tell me a little bit about the course. What was the makeup of the course, the environment that you experienced?
Okay. The makeup of the course in social psychology was an attempt to use not only theories of psychology in terms of describing human behavior, but how these behaviors affected our communities. And so it focused a great deal on the environment of the 1960s, both locally and nationally. A class of about 24 students. I happened to be the only non-white student in class, but Dr. Clark, being very erudite and very diplomatic and encouraging as a professor, it was a great learning environment.
Edward, I know you had an assignment in the course that was, in particular, very memorable. Tell me a little bit about that assignment.
Yes, the highlight of the course was Dr. Clark assigning 24 books to the 24 students. And the way he did it was he had a list, and he would ask students to raise their hands as he called out the title of a book and give them a chance to select the book they wanted to read, review, and present in class. The bottom of that list contained a book called Dark Ghetto. And although I raised my hand throughout the choices, it became pretty frightening to me that the last book on that list was going to be mine. And when he got to Dark Ghetto, having ignored me or overlooked me for all the other book titles, he said, "Brewington, you've got Dark Ghetto."
That must have been pretty daunting to get assigned the book written by the professor himself. What were your impressions of the book, reactions, and I'm curious, how did that go over with Dr. Clark?
Well, yeah, in my reaction, you're absolutely right. It was frightening because here I am going to present a book written by the author who also happens to be my professor and who was going to also grade me in the course. So the fright factor was pretty paramount there. But I did the job as asked, and interestingly enough, Dr. Clark and I had a different take on the book. He presented what I consider to be the ills and problems of the community, both from a political point of view and from a community action point of view. And I felt that he had sort of presented it in such a way that the people in those communities would see it as an attack on what they were doing. He disagreed with me on that. He said it wasn't an attack. I understand why he would say that, because he was an academic and he was presenting the facts as he saw them. And subsequently, the reaction, I think, by the community sort of supported my impression that they viewed it as an attack, and they were not appreciative of Dr. Clark actually telling it like it was.
What effect did the book have on you, short or in the long term?
Thank you. I would say that in taking his course in social psychology, it sort of really made me aware of some of the things that he was talking about that existed in the communities. I didn't really know much about so-called ghetto communities. I grew up in the South, came to New York, lived in the borough of Queens, and although I had moved to Harlem as a student at City College, I knew very little about the characteristics of the ghetto. So I became much more curious as to what were some of the things that were pretty prominent in the community, and eventually went on to study criminal psychology. And in fact, one of my first jobs out of college was to work as a New York State parole officer, supervising felons released from New York State prisons. So it led me into a field of psychology for a while.
Edward, following the conclusion of your course at CCNY, did you have any other interactions or impressions from your experience with the Clark family that you wanted to share?
Probably not immediately after I left City College. However, I, over the years, paid attention to his time at City College, and I was pleased to see him get tenure, which was no small accomplishment, especially for a faculty person of color back in the 1960s. Many years later, I met Hilton Clark, his son, and we talked about the appreciation and his love for his father and what his father had contributed to not only academia, but to the civil rights movement. This is the extensive obituary of Dr. Clark, May 2nd, 2005, in the New York Times.
Edward, I understand that Dr. Clark wrote an inscription at the front of Dark Ghetto for you. Do you mind reading it?
To Edward Brewington, with best wishes and the hope that you soon find the courage for the real encounter and dare to risk the confrontation with your thoughts and feelings. Kenneth B. Clark.